Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. These are video lectures being brought to you by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. We are in module 4, and which is entitled Culture Industries, Cultural Forms. We are now in the third lecture entitled Media. You will recall that the last two lectures were devoted to culture industry and the smallest unit really of cultural forms, which is the commodity, which we call the equivalent of the molecule in science. As always, let's do first a recap of what we did in the last lecture. The last lecture was, in the last lecture we talked about culture industries, and that culture was in the service of capitalism and that it perpetuates the capitalist ethos. We also looked at that aspect from the point of view of the commodity. We saw that after Marx, the commodity has two kinds of values, which is the use value or utility of the commodity and its exchange value, that is the value it has as something that is exchanged in the market. We also looked at a very important term, not only in Marxism, but a term which is applied today to cultural studies, various aspects of cultural studies, namely the idea of commodity fetishism. And we found the commodity fetishism is a term that was given to us by Marxism, and we found that commodities in this understanding have a surface appearance, a very attractive surface appearance, but that really masks the underlying foundation or underlying system of exploitation of the laborer. Okay, so in commodity fetishism, surface appearances mask or obscure the exploitative relationships in production. Then we also found through Chris Barker what we could say on meanings in commodities, and we find that meanings in commodities arise from two aspects, that is their design and production, which are modified, okay, according to needs, which are modified, and in their modification they give new meanings to commodities through the representation process. And finally, we saw interestingly how Jean Baudrillard adds another aspect to the value of commodities that was hitherto given by Karl Marx, and he said that commodities not only have use value or exchange value, but also something he calls sign value. Okay, so sign value gives symbolic meanings, which are also a characteristic of commodities, which were not really, extended or explained. Explained in, at least in the way in which cultural studies does today. Therefore, commodities are no longer really commodities. It is not that they are not material, tangible objects, but commodities are now commodity signs. Okay, commodities are material commodities, all right, but along with them, their sign value becomes immensely important. So, well, now the lecture today is on media, and in the beginning I would like to state that this lecture is general in nature. Okay, you too would be aware of the fact that media is something that you could really devote an entire course to media. You could have 40 lectures only on various aspects of the media, right? So as we have done with other lectures, other topics, what we are going to do here is we are going to look at media from a cultural studies perspective. Media studies is an area of study, all right. It's a very important burgeoning area of study. But we are going to, since our course is entitled Cultural Studies and we are looking at all aspects of culture through the methodology of cultural studies, what we are going to do is similarly here look at media from a cultural studies methodology. Okay, as always, let me declare the key source texts in this lecture, which are Chris Barker's Cultural Studies, Theory and Practice, Chris Barker's The Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, Meenakshi Durham and Douglas Kellner's edited book, Media and Cultural Studies, which is the main book really for this lecture, and Toby Miller's edited companion to Cultural Studies. Fine. Now, we are first going to define media, and by media, what is media? Media, when you talk about media, you're talking about a medium, okay? A medium through which a message is given to you. So, very broadly speaking, okay, anything really, any act of communication which goes through a medium is referred to as media, media being the plural form of medium. That's why when we say medium, media, we usually should say media are. But anyway, for convenience sake, I would refer to it as a singular. So when we talk about media here, we are really referring to mass media, okay? So Barker says, let's read from him, the mass media are those institutions of communication such as newspapers, magazines, television, and the film industry. So what falls under mass media? These are, as we saw, newspapers, the film industry, magazines, televisions, etc. And what is their role or function? That produce and distribute texts on a large scale. Now this is important in the context of capitalist modernity. We shall see a while later that by media we simply, it never meant only mass media as we understand it, as a television, for instance, or films. But if you're talking about mass media, then mass media has to happen under a capitalist modernity, right? There has, to be certain characteristics. There have to be certain characteristics. You'll recall all this was discussed in the first lecture when we talked about culture industry, and we also said that culture industry is really a new term to refer to the mass media. Okay, so whereas in the first lecture we talked about the industry aspect of it, in this lecture we are going to talk about media forms in general, and the next lecture is going to be devoted to one media form, which is the television. Okay, so the mass media therefore are all these things which have to be produced and consumed under a capitalist modernity. The functions, let's read again, the functions of the mass media might be seen as those of providing information, entertainment, and education. So let's look at it in this diagram. Therefore, we have mass media are the institutions of communication. Okay, remember these are this is a very important point. We are not only talking about media forms. Media forms come to us through certain institutions. Okay, so institutions of communications that are there in capitalist modernity and whose main functions are information, the dissemination of information, entertainment, and education, that is the acquiring of knowledge. Okay, so these are the functions of media as given to us by Chris Barker. Fine, as I said, we would talk about mass media and say that mass media didn't happen only in capitalist modernity. It has a history. It may not have been early on in Europe, particularly in England. It would not, may not have taken or may not have happened or taken the garb of capitalist modernity or the characteristics of capitalist modernity. Nevertheless, like all media forms and all cultural forms really, media also had a history. So in the 15th century, okay, with John Gutenberg, many of you are aware of this, we have the printing press. Okay, so with the printing press, what kind of media, that it was also a medium, right? So you were printing, for the first time you were printing books which were for wider dissemination, right? A growing public, at least a public that was beginning, would eventually grow in the 17th and 18th century to large proportions. The kind of texts that were there in this time, please look at this slide, are religious, literary, medical, and legal texts. The nature of the texts were these, and by simply looking at the nature of the media text, that is a printed text during those times, you can also eventually, explore use these as tools to find out what kind of culture was there in 15th century Europe, particularly 15th century England. Next, we move on to the 16th and 17th centuries, and we find that the 16th and 17th centuries, the printing press further produced periodicals and newspapers. So there weren't any newspapers really before this time, okay. So newspapers are a media form, all of you are aware of that, okay. Newspapers and periodicals, right. These were produced after the printing press revolution really began, and in the 17th and 18th century, the media forms that were added to the hitherto existing books or pamphlets were periodicals and newspapers. In the 19th century, we had these media forms really becoming industries, right. So we find, look at this slide here please, in the 19th century, we had the book and newspaper industries, and a phenomenal increase really in the reading public, okay, the number of people who were reading, and also this is tied to those of you who do social history, cultural history would not find it difficult to relate to the fact that these industries were growing. Why? Because there was the availability of leisure time. People had the time to read books. People had the time to read newspapers. More and more people were reading newspapers and books. Okay, women, in the 18th and 19th century in England, you will find a phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, where women were also formed a different segment, okay, of reading. So in the 19th century, we had book and newspaper industries, and then in the 20th and the 21st centuries, we have this, we had this radically new form, which is the electronic media and the new media. Okay, I shall devote a whole lecture to new media, a couple of lectures from now, but you see that media also, like other cultural forms, have a history, and the history of cultural forms again forms a subdomain of cultural studies. So in the 20th and 21st centuries, electronic media and new media are completely, going to, if not completely, are going to add a wholly new dimension, okay, a radically new dimension to media. So Durham and Meenakshi Durham and Douglas Kellner's Media and Cultural Studies, which is a very important, very useful edited volume, which brings writers as diverse as, in time at least, as Karl Marx and João Baudrillard and Mark Poster, right? And from areas relating to globalization, to political economy, to semiotics, to feminism. So in their introductory piece on, in the book, this is what they say, and let us read from here and I shall explain. It is increasingly clear that media and culture today are of central importance to the maintenance and reproduction of contemporary societies. Okay, media and culture and all other cultural forms help enable the reproduction of contemporary societies. Societies, like species, need to reproduce to survive, and culture activates attitudes and behavior that predispose people to consent to established ways of thought and conduct, thus integrating, this is very important, integrating individuals to a specific socio-economic system. Okay, why do we think alike about certain things? Why? What is the commonality in us? Why is it that we can speak from a certain platform? We understand one another, even though many of our beliefs may be different, many of our thoughts may be different. There are segments of people who think in different ways, but still there is the way we can communicate. Douglas Kellner and Meenakshi Durham believe, okay, that it is media and other cultural forms that helps to cultivate, okay, in the population, helps to cultivate certain attitudes and behavior by which we give consent to a certain dominant order, okay, to establish, as they say, ways of thought, ways of thinking. Thus, how do you integrate the individual into a system, right? Integrating individuals to a specific socio-economic system, for instance, say capitalism, or feudalism, okay? How do you integrate the people? You will have to give them common, that is why we say mass media. The masses are educated, okay? What is the function of media? The function of media is not simply to entertain. The function of media is to give information, okay, and to disseminate knowledge among people. Knowledge may not be highly specialized knowledge, okay? So what happens is there are common things, so to speak. There is a common pool of knowledge, okay, from which we derive, a common knowledge that helps us to integrate ourselves into the system. Then they say forms of media culture like television, film, popular music, magazines, and advertising provide role and gender models. For instance, these again, they are not only, as I said, for education, for amusement, for entertainment, and for knowledge. What is important is, even as we are enjoying a media product, even as we are enjoying a television serial, or you're watching a documentary or the news, what happens is, side by side, certain models are created of behavior, okay? For instance, if these are all ways of representation. For instance, the good mother, the way the good mother is shown on television, in television advertisements, okay? There you will see that there is a certain commonality, right? Or the advertisers cash in on a particular way of showing a mother. A mother is usually young, a mother is usually good looking, a mother is with a child of a certain kind. Of course, the product that is being shown here will determine how it is represented. But if you look next time, if you look carefully at the advertisements, you see how you have a certain kind of woman being presented here, okay? Also, gender role models, where if there is, for instance, a food product that has been shown, it is usually, if not always, the woman who is shown to be given that fruit drink or given that item of that food item to the child. It is very rarely that a man is showing. Whenever the husband is shown there, or whenever the father is shown there, the father is interestingly shown as also enjoying the food with the child, okay, and commenting on the food that it is good or good, etc. So what happens by repetition? These are, I may even use the word, bombarded to us all the time, and they make, they create certain role models that a good mother has to be this, a good mother has to be looked like that, and women try and approximate those gender roles and models. So again, let's read. Forms of media culture like television, film, popular music, magazines, and advertising provide role and gender models. Fashion hints, right? Fashion hints, lifestyle images, and icons of personality. Right? The narratives of media culture offer patterns. Look at this, patterns. These are not individual. These are not tailor-made for us, okay? We are to fit into them. They only give us some patterns, right? And the patterns, by being repeatedly represented on the screen or in the book. For instance, the Mills and Boon romance, which in our time was a very common kind of novel that we read. The Mills and Boon romances kind of interpolated or beckoned out to the reader, okay, to produce a certain kind of woman and a certain kind also of man, okay. So it is not simply television, but also books that can, or genres, particular genres that can create that can help create models to which many people aspire. So the narratives of media culture offer patterns of proper and improper behavior. What is proper behavior and what is improper behavior? These are also sought to, these are also learned by us from the media products. So the narratives of media culture offer patterns of proper and improper behavior, even moral messages and ideological conditioning. So the way you are going to look at the world, perceive the world, these are also being taught to you by the media products, okay. Then what they do, let's read on from here, sugar-coating social and political ideas with pleasurable and seductive forms of popular entertainment. Popular entertainment with these very attractive images, what they do is ultimately They also serve, remember what Adorno and Horkheimer had said that the culture industry and their forms, what do? They only perpetuate and maintain the capitalist order, okay? In the same way here, we find that these media forms, they sugarcoat social and political ideas with pleasurable and seductive forms of popular entertainment. For instance, any ideology that you're going to read as a scholar, okay, that may be either shown to you in a positive light, or that may be sort of shown to you in a parodic form by these so-called sugar-coated media items. Therefore, culture, as they say, Kellner and Durham say, culture is ordinary, a familiar part of everyday life, yet special cultural artifacts are extraordinary. One of the main things that that has remained with us, and which I highlighted in the first 2 lectures in module 1, is that culture, as understood in cultural studies as a discipline, culture is not, culture is not dance or music. People usually when they say a cultural program, they mean dance or theater or whatever. Culture is certainly, as you know by now, not understood in that light in cultural studies. Culture is everyday life. Culture is the ordinary, everything that is happening around all the time, okay? That is what culture is. Culture is about everyday practices. So they say that culture is ordinary, a familiar part of everyday life, yet special cultural artifacts are extraordinary. Why are they extraordinary? They are extraordinary in the sense that they help people to see and understand things they have never quite perceived, like certain novels or films that, this is important, change your view of the world. How many times you may have thought or even told your friend that this particular film or this particular book changed, it was a landmark experience for me, it changed my life. So we use phrases like this, okay, or it gave me new life, for instance, right? So special cultural artifacts, again, these are media forms, right? Your everyday practices are the practices that you go through. Media is of course a part of everyday practices, but then these artifacts, these cultural forms are made, they are produced, right? They are a result of the production process. Okay, so they are in that sense extraordinary, and many a book and many a film have really also affected us so much that we even say that these have changed our us or changed our lives. Fine. So I would like to draw your attention to John Ernie's essay. This essay is in the edited volume, as I said, Media and Cultural Studies by Meenakshi Durham and Douglas Kellner. And the essay is entitled Media Studies and Cultural Studies, a Symbiotic Convergence. Okay, after talking a bit in general about media, we are now trying to see, again, as I said, we are doing a cultural studies analysis, right? We are trying to find out the relation of cultural studies. We are trying to see how cultural studies looks at media, right? So this essay is, in that sense, throws a great deal of light on this. Media studies and cultural studies, a symbiotic convergence. Now he points to the commonalities between media studies and cultural studies, in that he says there are 3 common things that are shared by media studies and cultural studies. Remember, we are already making a distinction between media studies and cultural studies. Okay, we have to remember this. Cultural studies cannot swallow up media studies. Media studies cannot swallow up cultural studies. We begin by accepting that fact, and then we go on to say that there is a convergence, nevertheless, between media studies and cultural studies. So the commonalities between media studies and cultural studies are, one, that there is a mutual accessibility. There is a mutual accessibility in the sense that both, the areas of study, the concerns of cultural studies, the forms that that it looks at, and media and the forms in media, okay, each can access the other. In fact, that is, the discourses are common, and each, media studies can comment on cultural studies, and cultural studies can comment on media studies. Second, there are shared methods. let me give you an example. For instance, as a methodology, Marxism, right? Marxism, you know, is one of the theoretical schools of cultural studies. In the same way, there is a very strong Marxist school in media studies, right? So once you have a common platform, for instance, semiotics, it is not that semiotics is not a part of media studies, but semiotics is also a part of cultural studies, okay? Feminism in media studies, feminism in cultural studies, ethnography on and even ethnicity in both, okay? So you find that there are many common areas, but you know, each of these two domains would like to sort of demarcate their boundaries and say that no, we are not exactly the same. The second is shared methods, and as I said, you know, there are both these concerns share the same methodology to a large extent. Then production and reception of cultural texts and commodities. The way texts, the way texts are produced and the way they are received by audiences, right? The cultural texts, commodities, there are also similarities as far as the discourse is concerned, or at least there are convergences between media studies and cultural studies. Therefore, we may also safely say after Ernie that cultural studies has, if we can say that media studies comes before cultural studies as a domain, then we can also, after Ernie, claim this, that cultural studies has reconfigured media studies. Okay, this is an important point. Just a while ago we saw that there are convergences, there are very similar, some very strikingly similar things between cultural studies and media studies, but we have to see that with the coming in of cultural studies, media studies has also been reconfigured or undergone change. For instance, the first point, if you look at this slide, the first point here is semiological criticism, which may have been a part of media studies, okay, gains more place now in media studies, okay. Why? Because you know that semiotics or study of science systems and signifying practices, they are immensely important. They are, they form, so to speak, a part of the bedrock of cultural studies, right? If you remember our initial lectures. And what happens is, in this reconfiguration of media studies by cultural studies, semiological criticism or criticism based on media and the science of media products, this is occupying more space, so to speak, in mainstream media studies. Secondly, identity-based media studies. One we saw was to do with the sign. The second is there is an increase in media studies which look at different areas which look at how identity is constructed by these media forms. If you really look at older ways of media analysis and media forms, a huge one hand, the huge part of it has behind it clearly, if I may use the word, a classical Marxism, right? Based on the classical base and superstructure, right? Superstructure architecture, where media is seen as a part of the superstructure, okay? But it is not that that kind of study hasn't gone, but I would say that, even a semiological criticism of media or an identity-based media criticism that looks at media representation, for instance, okay, will make this political economy approach to media studies the richer. Do you understand? As I have always felt that whenever you make a clearly structuralist or a deconstructionist analysis of media forms, okay, we cannot stop only at doing that analysis. We would have to say why this analysis came, or why this propensity, or why this trajectory came about, okay, in the media form in the first place, right? So mass media studies then we may say is enriched by cultural studies in the fact that the politics of popular culture. This is important, okay? The politics of popular culture is further the power and the politics of popular culture is highlighted by cultural studies, and also the structural and historical aspects of media, and the, remember talking about consent, how, in order to be integrated into a particular socio-economic system, what happens is that the individual, okay, has these forms that beckon to him or her to consent to the dominant order. So we also find that cultural studies has strengthened studies of hegemony, okay, studies of manufactured consent as far as media studies is concerned. Therefore, if we were to say, or if we were to delineate the scope of media studies, then we would say that the scope of media studies, after it has been sort of impacted by, or after it has been affected by cultural studies methodologies, after the symbiosis, so to speak, today looks at text, looks at media text. Now, when we say media text, we are talking of a text in the sense of it being a signifying system, okay? So that even something you watch every day, which is the news, right? Whether or if you are still a radio buff, you're listening to a news item, okay, on the radio, right? That news item that you watch on television or you're listening to on the radio, what happens is that becomes a text to be decoded. And cultural studies semiological criticism gives, scholars the tools by which they can analyze a media text, okay, with a lot of dexterity. Then political economy, as I had said, it was there before, and it is still a very it's a very important part of the scope of cultural studies of media. Then the relationship between text and audiences, the audience studies are increasingly becoming very, very important. Concurrently with the semiological approach that looks at text, the reception of media, and we do away with the older school of thought where the audience is just a passive receiver of the media message, okay, or the communicating media form, okay. Today we also, as we shall see, even in the lecture on television, as we shall see, today what is happening is, we're talking about segmented audiences. We're talking about audiences that have different needs. We are, looking at different even age segments, for instance, what programs the young look for, what programs the old or the middle age look for, okay. So the relationship between text and audiences is another part of the scope of media and cultural studies convergence. And finally, but not the last, the wider patterns of cultural meaning. Now, if the texts tell us about meaning, then we are also looking at the wider patterns of meaning through the political economy, particularly the political economy or the feminist approach, or the approaches based on race, for instance. Okay, we are looking for wider socio-cultural patterns there, not just semiological meaning patterns. This is very important for us. Okay, otherwise we'll simply be doing micro level studies, right? So we are looking for cultural meaning, wider patterns of cultural meaning that can tell us a lot about the background, okay, of that is the political economy of production, distribution and consumption, and the relationship between text and audience. This is also part of the wider patterns of cultural meaning that arise. Fine. Therefore, the cultural studies focus on media have, to put it in another way, have to do with ideologies, have to do with identity, with cultural hegemony, with textual meanings and polysemy. Polysemy is poly means many, that is many meanings, okay, meanings that come up are given to us by an increasingly heterogeneous audience, like many meanings coming from many different kinds of audiences. And of course, time, how time, space and routines and patterns of behavior and patterns of life in the family in particular are woven around the media, okay, how time, space and routine are are affected by the media. For instance, when do you watch your favorite program? Your favorite program takes up that time, okay? It becomes a routine for you, it becomes routinized practices, okay? Your space and time and practices are determined by media to a certain extent. Therefore, whereas, originally we would talk about media as power, okay, we find that increasingly people are talking about, please look at the slide here, people are talking about media as resource, okay. In the first format, we had this sort of an idea that, well, media is all powerful, and different media forms are going to create the audience, it's going to create desire in the audience, much in the way in which Adorno and Horkheimer, if you remember, in their deliberations on culture industry, remember these points of similarity, of sameness, of mass deception, right? All these things are there, but we see that there is a shift to media as resource. Okay, so media is now today people can resist media. People can see, so to speak, through the representation. People can see through the message, and they can use media as a resource in quite a different way than it was, probably envisioned earlier. Okay, as I said, the idea of the passive consumer of media products no longer holds, right? Today, audiences are well informed. Audiences can even, you can even file, a public interest litigation against a particular media item or program or text if you think that it is not quite right for a channel to be showing a certain program or a book to be forwarding a certain point. Okay, so what did we see here? We saw that media as a form of power today is, of course it's there, but as I said, there is a shift. There is a shift, with a thematic shift to media as resource, as used by people. Then I would like to point to an essay by Dallas Smith, which is in the same book, in the same collection, and this is a very important concept of what is called audience commodity or audience work, right? Now, you must be wondering, how does audience become a commodity and how do audiences work? After all, audiences do not work. Work is something we leave behind when we come to media. We come for leisure, we come for pleasure, okay, and for entertainment. But let's look at what Smith has to say and what are the formulations he makes on audience commodity, the concept of audience commodity and audience work. To suggest that the mass media audience is a commodity and that audiences work is to raise many questions which unsettle established ways of thinking. He admits the fact that, as I said a while earlier, how can audience ever be a commodity and how can audiences, quote unquote, work, right? Now, he goes on to say, as most audience work centers in the home. Now, this is why this is invisible, right? Audience work is invisible because it happens in, it is situated usually to a large extent in the home. As most audience work centers in the home, all the other functions of the family, look at this, all the other functions of the family become involved in considering the implications of the proposition, focus on, of the proposition and focus on the family. In order to analyze a largely commoditized society, we must beware thinking of people and commodities as disconnected. People, normally, what is the idea we have? Here is a commodity in front of me. Here is a commodity, particularly say on the shelf in the market, in the mall in front of me. And I am an agent, I am a subject, and I am buying the commodity. The commodity is not me, and I am not the commodity. Okay? But Smith and others of this school, of the audience commodity and audience work school of thought, in cultural studies and media studies, they point to the fact that, we must be aware and alert to the fact that there is a tendency to disconnect, to show a disconnect between people and commodities, right? We have to see them, as the slide shows here, relationships in a social process. So, media forms, media commodities, okay, media items, media texts are not separate from people. Okay, there is a relationship between between people and the commodities that they purchase, and we shall see in a while how. Right now, how does media affect, so to speak, how how does media come into the home? You know that the home is, as said by Smith, the home is the site or the locale where audience commodity and audience work happens. Now he says that, for instance, marital relations are affected by media products. Okay, so that if you think that you are a person who is consuming, okay, paying for the channel, so you are a consumer, you are buying these media items, okay, and you're consuming it, and if you think that you're just you're relaxing and you're simply being entertained by it, it doesn't seem to be so, right? Audience work is involved in the sense that you have to, whatever you are enjoying, you're also in the back of your mind working it out, right? There are comparisons being made, there are issues that crop up, right? And therefore, the audience in that sense has to work, right? Leisure, in the same way, leisure activities, consumer expenditure, child care and development, and decision making, these are the different domains which are affected, by affected by the media as far as aspects of home and family life are concerned. Okay, and it is wrong, as Smith says rightly, you should be aware of the fact that people and commodities, in this case commodities of mass media, that they are separate. Okay, there is a relationship between them. Next, as far as audience studies is concerned, even if you do empirical studies of audience, when you select a certain sample or you do a survey of how audiences, a particular segment, for instance, how a middle class, how the middle class in a particular place, okay, how they respond to a media product. There is also, even in those studies, it's not about how many hours a week do you watch television, or what are the programs that you watch, and who has control over the remote, etc. Apart from such statistical questions, okay, the shift is in audience studies today towards, and this is clearly something that has been contributed by cultural studies. Okay, so there is a shift, and this shift centers around issues of subjectivity and identity. Okay, what happens to subjectivity of individuals when they peruse media products, right? How do people construct and reconstruct identities based on media forms? How do audiences resist the ways in which some media forms seek, advertisement, for instance, seek to create the identity? Okay, some advertisements are like mirrors, right, in which you're supposed to see yourself. If you do not see yourself in that particular garb and form and structure, then or that look, you have fallen behind, or you are not up to the mark for that. Okay, so issues of subjectivity and identity again are not in the narrow sense understood as things that are formed by the media, okay, things that are over which media forms have control. Okay, we also have the audience answering, or say speaking back, if you will, okay, to the media forms. So in this sense, we have a school of thought, or one orientation in media studies, which is called the users and gratification school of thought, which says that issues of subjectivity and identity, okay, are to do with, are also tied in with the users of media forms, of media texts. Okay, they also they are about the gratification and satisfaction, okay, that are that we receive from media forms. In that, for instance, look at this slide here, please. As uses and gratification, one of the ways is that definitely there is a withdrawal. It helps you escape from certain pressures, even if in the end it doesn't, act as a complete escape from, from work, from drudgery. Remember, that kind of theory doesn't hold anymore, because we already have a whole school of thought saying that it is audience work, right? And we also saw in, I think, Adorno's and Horkheimer's essay in the first lecture of this module, that entertainment can also be boring. Entertainment is also leisure is a prolongation of work, okay, because it is the same socio-economic setup that is reproduced and maintained, so to speak, largely by these media forms. Okay, so there is at least an illusion, if you will, of escape or withdrawal, which is very gratifying to people. And personal relationships and social interaction are also part of the uses of media. Why? Because when you, as I said, when you watch, we'll talk more about this probably when you talk about television. When you watch a program, when you read a book, usually you don't keep it to yourself. These are motivations for conversation, motivations for conviviality, for instance, right? Okay, so personal relationships can also be affected, and you put media forms to use. You put media forms to use for your personal relationships and social interaction, and personal identity and values, right, are also under the schema of the users, and in the sense of formation of identity. And definitely media has a very powerful, what should I use? It's a very powerful tool for the creation of values. It is not that we completely negate and we are alert and we say, no, now I'm going to watch a program and I'm not going to take the values of the program. After all, it's an interpellation, it's a seduction. Okay, it is packaged in a certain way, it's part of the capitalist system. It is never as simple as that, though many would want it to be like that. We are always in a sort of dialogue, and if you may will, a dialectical relationship with media forms and ourselves. Okay, we build on what media give us, we revise them, resist them, but we do not completely, I feel, do not really negate these things. Okay, so part of the users and gratification schema of media products, which is a very rich area of study. Okay, this also includes a study of what is hidden in the very process of users and gratification. Then I would like to end with the point about taste cultures. Okay, now certainly if you just have to look around and see how many television channels are there, not only in your own place, not only nationally, but also internationally. You can see the amount, the increase in the number of media forms that are available to us. So what happens in that case is there is a growing competition, and with the lower costs of production, what happens is these highly different channels, and for instance, you have channels today only on travel, you have channels on food, okay, you have channels on education, you have channels to do with various forms of entertainment, you have channels which are for children, we have the cartoon channels, right? So what happens is, with the proliferation of media forms, right, I'm talking about television here, but it also applies to all other media forms like books, films, etc. Now, with the availability of more kinds of films, for instance, and more kinds of books, we have taste cultures that are developing. Okay, this is also a cultural studies contribution to media studies. There are taste cultures that are developing, and we shall see that these new, let's look at this, these new taste cultures are highly segmented. Okay, for instance, ethnicity. You may have programs that are never watched by you, right? You have never stopped at that channel, okay? Whereas there are channels which others do not watch, but you watch with a lot of avidness, right? So ethnicity could be one point. For instance, an ethnic group may have propensity for watching certain kinds of programs which show their own ethnic cultures, for instance, and also as a person who does not belong to a particular ethnic group. For instance, you may be very interested in knowing about a community, right? And you go on to a certain channel to to watch what that community is like, what their culture is like, what their intellectual forms are like. Okay. In the same way, age is another segment, or rather another taste culture. Different age groups definitely have different taste cultures. Not everybody watches MTV, and not everybody watches the yoga channels, right? So with new taste cultures are forming, and there is really this, you would say, this fragmentation and this creation of ever new and micro levels of taste cultures. Then genres, of course, people go by genres, by types of media products. Education is another determiner here. Gender and work rhythms. For instance, those who work in the daytime and those whose work entails working in the night time. Okay, then their work rhythms are different and their taste cultures are different. Though I must add here, with the coming in of the facility of recording, okay, in these cable providers give you facilities for recording programs that you may watch in other times. This work rhythm factor may not today hold for very long. And also political orientation. Political orientation may lead you to watch certain channels and not others. For instance, you also have channels that are to do with, as I said, to do with religion. Okay, so those who are of a religious orientation will peruse those channels. Okay, this is again not to say that the young do not look at some channels or that men do not look at other channels, but that seems to be the scenario here. Therefore, let's go to the discussion, and very quickly a couple of questions. How have media forms changed historically? Okay, we found that media forms, it's not that mass media, though today mass media may have a huge, along with new media, okay, there is really an explosion where the audience is very diverse, very different, enormous in number. However, we may go back to the 15th century with the beginning of the printing press, and then moving on to the 16th and 17th centuries, where to the previous books and pamphlets were added, periodicals and newspapers on various topics. In the 19th century, books and newspapers became industries. Okay, became industries in order to cater to a growing reading public. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have electronic media and the new media, to do with which is a digital media, on which I shall be, devoting a whole lecture in a couple of lectures from now. Then outline the relationship between media studies and cultural studies. This is perhaps our most important point, and we go by John Ernie in saying that there are commonalities between media studies and cultural studies, even as these two domains try to quite zealously really to retain their boundaries, and to say that, for instance, media studies would say that cultural studies, we are not followed up by cultural studies. Okay, so we accept that, and we say that there are convergences. Okay, convergences which talk about mutual accessibility of areas, okay, of discourses from one to other, and there are shared methods. And I have given you the example of political economy method, for instance, and today of the semiological approach of identity-based criticism, which are shared by both media and cultural studies, and the production and reception of cultural texts and commodities, and media being a cultural text, definitely this is one, almost you could say, an overlapping area in media and cultural studies. Cultural studies, it is claimed, has reconfigured media studies, in that cultural studies has come a little later, institutionalized cultural studies has come a little later perhaps than media studies, and therefore has, with its coming, there is a reconfiguration of media studies, in the sense that there is increasing importance on the politics of the sign, the power structures involved in the sign, in the media text, and there is also interest in identity-based criticism, and this key word in cultural studies, this key concept, that is representation. Okay, how are things represented in the media? This is how if you to zoom in on one area, this is it. Therefore, mass media studies today talk about the politics of popular culture, the historical and structural aspects, and also hegemony in newer ways. Then what are the specific concerns of cultural studies as far as media is concerned? The special concerns are to do with ideologies, identity, cultural hegemony, textual meanings and polysemy, and of time, space and routines as our lived lives are concerned. So, well, I hope I was able to at least tell you or show you some of the ways in which cultural studies and media studies converge, some of the ways in which cultural studies has thrown open new areas, okay, particularly as I said, the politics of the sign, semiology, okay, polysemy, and newer forms of political economy studies, right. So these you stay with this, and we are going to talk about television and new media in the next few lectures, followed by cyberculture, and therein also we will see how cultural studies has helped us, okay, in developing a discourse and a methodology. Thank you so much.